My name is Taylor. I'm a pastor in Georgia, and I want to give 10 responses to the 10 most common Torah observant objections that I run into. By Torah observants, I take that to mean those who believe that we are still under the covenant given at Sinai. And I think, like Paul in the New Testament, this movement, Paul is dealing often with opponents in the New Testament who are partially clinging to Torah. They are selective Torah observants who hang on to Sinai, and Paul is constantly bringing them back to say, actually, that's not all the Torah says. And so I think similar to this movement, they are selective Torah observants. And here's 10 reasons why, or 10 responses to their objections. First, when they say that they keep Torah's food laws, they typically mean the Levitical laws. The problem is there are multiple covenants in Torah with multiple food stipulations. So you go to Genesis 2, verse 16. What is Adam told here? The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden." What's important here is the garden is a subsection of Eden, and Eden is a subsection of the whole earth. Okay, these categories are just important because in a moment, Adam is going to be kicked out of Eden. And then, if you look at the curse in 3 verse 18, Adam is then told now he's going to eat the plants of the field. So these are different plants in a cursed field as opposed to the lush fruit of the trees in the garden. So we've already got a dietary shift here, and I think this is a covenant here, by the way. Hosea 6 verse 7 says that as Israel broke the covenant like Adam, or Israel broke the covenant like Adam did. And I think it's saying Israel is just like Adam. Adam broke this covenant. There's an implied covenant here with the blessings and curses. So Israel did. So you've got this covenant, the covenant of works with Adam, with its stipulations. Then you've got in Genesis 9, you have an expansion of the food stipulations. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So now we have a new list of dietary foods under the Noahic covenant. It's important to recognize this covenant is meant to preserve the creation as we wait for the arrival of the Messiah. So Noah is told, even though the ground's cursed, even though man is wicked, God is not going to judge the earth again. He's going to preserve it. And under this preservation, mankind is told, just as the green plants, so you can eat animals. So that's second set of dietary restrictions, and I do, for the next question I'll explain, I think these are different than the Levitical legislation, the Sinai legislation that we have in Leviticus 11, for example. So if you're going to tell me you observe the food laws of Torah, you have a dilemma because there are multitudes of different dietary restrictions. So which ones are you referring to? So in Genesis 7, verse 8, Noah is commanded of clean animals and of animals that are not clean. He's going to bring them into the ark. He brought them into the ark. And so they'll often say, hey, clearly Noah knew these categories. Therefore, when he was told he could eat animals, that's all he was hearing was, I need to eat just the clean animals. The problem is, the command in Genesis 9 verse 3, or really the promise, it's not restricted to clean animals. And I'll give you a few reasons why. If you look at the Hebrew here, in Hebrew narrative, the lines always begin with an and or a wa, right? The sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and you see it right here. You've got this little line here. It looks like a backwards, or it looks like a shortened 7. You've got it there, you've got it there. And what that tells you in Hebrew narrative is this line is just continuing what happened at the last line. It's just happening over and over again. And when you have a line that doesn't have this wa, or this conjunction, what you have is usually two things. Either a new section, or a summary statement of the previous section. If you look at verse 3, you'll notice there is no wa here, but I also have highlighted this word. You have the word all, the Hebrew word for all here, kol, and what I want you to notice is it's actually there 7 times in verses 2 to 3. See it right here, 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 here. And so this is making the point to Noah that it's all his. And we see this especially at the very end here, where Noah is told that just as he was given green plants, he's given all. And it's, again, because it's being repeated 7 times, and he's told every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And then he's told, hey, remember, just as I gave all the green plants without restriction, I give you everything. And the point is, under this covenant, mankind is not to live in fear in terms of what they eat. Plants, animals, it's yours. Thinking of Malachi 3 or Hebrews 13, they'll then say, well, Sinai has to be perpetual because God doesn't change. And what they're doing is they're conflating the nature of God with his covenants. It's true, God does not change. But it's also true that Torah and the rest of Scripture shows that covenant stipulations do. You've got the covenant with Adam. You've got the covenant with Noah. You've got the covenant with Abraham, multiple covenants with Abraham. You've got the covenant with Moses. You've got the covenant with David. And the new covenant. I mean, you can look specifically at Deuteronomy chapter 5, and you'll actually see that this Sinai legislation isn't eternal. And I'm not talking about Torah. I'm talking about the Sinai covenant. And the reason I say it's not eternal is look what he says in verse 2 of chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant. So this covenant arrangement was not around with the previous generation. So it is finite to a degree. And I would say that's what Paul's arguing too in Galatians, because this came 430 years after the promise to Abraham. And so this covenant itself was not always in place, and so it has a beginning point. It wasn't with the previous generations. We see the same thing in Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8 speaks of this same covenant coming to a conclusion. You have verse 8, he finds fault with them. I've made videos before about how this is the covenant here. I've highlighted all the words covenant because it shows up again and again. Verse 6, Jesus has obtained a ministry that's more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better. So there's a new covenant. And so it goes on to explain that this new covenant arrangement is, verse 9, not like the covenant made with their fathers. For they did not continue in my covenant. For this covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord, I'll put my law into their minds and write them on their hearts. And I'll get to what this means towards the end of this video. But the point I'm making here is it's true. God does not change. His covenantal arrangements clearly do, according to Torah and the rest of the Bible. So in Isaiah 65, we have the prophecies of the new heavens and the new earth that Revelation speaks of. And if you scroll down to Isaiah 66, verse 17, it says, those who eat pig's flesh will come to an end together, declares the Lord. And there are several problems with this. Number one, if a Torah observant appeals to this, I always ask them, do you think death is going to be in the new creation? Are saints going to die in the new creation? And usually, in my experience, they've always said no. No, of course, like we're going to live forever. But if you're going to interpret Isaiah 66:17 literally, well, you also need to do the same for Isaiah 65, verse 20. For there, in Isaiah 65, verse 20, it says, no more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days. So children are going to grow up. They're not going to die young. Or an old man who does not fill out his day. He's going to live a long time. For the young man shall die at 100 years old. The point being, you're going to have a long life, but you're going to die. In other words, if you're going to take Isaiah 66, verse 17 literally, then you also need to recognize that Isaiah is saying there will be death in the new heavens and the new earth. Now, I don't think that's right, but that's because I understand Isaiah to be speaking of the Sinai covenant, which is typological. It's a type. Its categories are temporal because they are shadows of what's to come. right? This is Hebrews chapter 10. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And part of the reason I think this is the right way to read it, number one, is this is how the New Testament reads the Old. You have, for example, in Matthew 2, verse 15, where Jesus, or rather the Father says about Jesus, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Well, that was originally speaking to what God was doing for the nation of Israel in giving them the Sinai covenant. And now we see it's more finally and fully accomplished in Jesus as he fled from Herod. So the Sinai covenant is a type, it's a temporary shadow, including the category of those eating swine's flesh. And just to show you this, look at Revelation 22 at the end where the law is given. And I would say this is an allusion back to Isaiah 66. It says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to the tree of life. They may enter the city by the gates. Outside are the dogs, the sorcerers, the sexually immoral, murderers, idolaters, everyone who loves and practices falsehood." What's not there? I mean, this is the judgment that Isaiah 66 was talking about. The category of swine eaters is not there. Because that's a Mosaic shadow, and that has passed away. And so now we're seeing the true purpose of the law in that it's to liberate us from idolatry and to cause us to love and live faithful lives. And that's what John is summarizing here. The Sinai legislation has passed. We're seeing righteousness defined under the new covenant here. Now, I don't think those are in contradiction, and I'll explain in a little bit. But inevitably, we get into the discussion of Mark 7, verse 19. Mark 7, verse 19. So we have here in Mark 7, and actually let me pull up. You're going to need the Greek, not the Hebrew here. That would not help us. So we have Mark 7, 19. Let me start a little earlier. So you have in verse 14, Jesus calls the people. He's teaching. There's nothing outside a person that can go into him, that can defile him, but the things that come out, blah, blah, blah. All the way down to verse 19, where you have in the ESV, you have parentheses. So it's a parenthetical statement. And in this case, the reason it's parentheses is because the translators are saying this is an editorial comment. So it says, "Thus he, Jesus, declared all foods clean." So what the translators are suggesting is that this comment is not a part of the context of Jesus' discussion. It's true. Jesus is talking about hand washing. But when Mark brings up this comment here and says, "Thus he declared all foods clean," Mark isn't addressing the discussion at hand. Mark is addressing a discussion between his recipients, and he's showing that what Jesus has just said shapes and applies to the church. Hey, everything Jesus taught here, this is what it means for us, that Jesus declared all foods clean. In other words, if you're going to say, well, the context originally is hand washing because we can compare it to Matthew, you've missed what's actually happening here. We know that this editorial comment is not a part of the original conversation. Mark is inserting himself. He's turning to his audience and saying, okay, do you understand what this means, guys? You Jews and you Gentiles fighting over the food laws, he's made all foods clean, is how that editorial comment is functioning there. And the reason I think that's right is because we understand from church history that Mark was copying Peter's preaching. So Peter is preaching mostly in Rome. Mark is writing it down. And therefore, I think the audience that Mark is writing for is significantly mixed with Jews and Gentiles who would have quarreled over what constitutes food. Like, what is holiness now that we are a mixed people of Jews and Gentiles? This is what we see in Romans 14. And so Mark, compiling this gospel from Peter's preaching, inserts this comment and turns to his audience and says, okay, different from the context of Jesus' discussion, you guys listen up. Jesus' discussion means all food's clean. So, yeah, it's not a part of the original discussion. So saying, hey, that's not the right context, I agree, but it's because Mark is not talking in the original context. He's turning towards his recipients. Somebody then at this point will object that the Bible never speaks of a food being cleansed. The problem with that argument is Mark 7 verse 19, whatever you think the subject is, if you think it's the stomach, if you think it's Jesus, if you think it's something else, the verb here, katharidzon, and you can see it down here, katharidzon, panta ta bramata. This is the verb saying he's declared it, or the stomach's cleansed, whatever, however you want to say it. Panta is everything, all foods. So all foods have been cleansed. Whatever you think that means, that verb is saying foods have been cleansed. So it's happening right here in Mark 7 verse 19. But that, of course, leads us to the next objection, where you'll have some Torah observants who say, well, Mark 7:19 must have been added by men. And so, for example, pull out the King James Version, and if you'll notice, it doesn't really tell you whether this is the stomach that's cleansing the food or if it's Jesus declaring all foods clean. It just continues this sentence, and it doesn't suggest an editorial remark. It doesn't put it in parentheses. So what happens is Torah observants will look at an older manuscript like that, not a manuscript, a translation. They'll look at an older translation like that. Then they'll look at, say, like the ESV here, where it's in parentheses, and they'll say, this parenthetical remark is not in my translation. Therefore, it must have been added. But the problem is that's a confusion. The editorial remark in parentheses here is not here because it's been added. This katharidzon panta ta bramata is in our oldest manuscripts. Like, it's just not lacking. What's happened between the KJV and the ESV, for example, is the translators have recognized that there's no possible way that this verb, katharidzon, could be using the word stomach as the subject. And the reason that is because what we know about the Greek language is this is a participle here. This ending here indicates a masculine verb, and verbs don't normally have genders, but because this is a participle, it does. It functions like a noun sometimes. And so here, it has a gender. And we know that that's a masculine gender verb. And what that means is the subject it's looking for has to match. It's looking for a masculine subject. But the problem with the word stomach is the word stomach is a feminine noun. So katharidzon can't possibly be explaining that the stomach is what gets rid of the food. I can't think of the word. It's not saying the stomach gets rid of the food because that just doesn't work syntactically. Instead, katharidzon is looking for a masculine subject. And so what makes most sense of this phrasing here is that after Jesus' teaching has been summarized, Mark continues with Jesus as the subject, but then says, therefore, or he doesn't say therefore, he says cleansing all foods. Well, who's doing the cleansing? It's not the stomach, it's Jesus. Jesus is cleaning all foods. So again, the parenthetical remark isn't there because it was added by men. It's because translators understand the syntax, and the KJV and translations that try to make it look like possibly the stomach is the subject, it's just not possible. So some of your modern translations have accounted for that by putting it in parentheses and saying, this is Mark inserting himself to say this is what this means. At this point, you'll get somebody who says pork wasn't considered food, and I think this is a strange argument for at least two reasons. Number one, if it wasn't considered food, there would have never been a need for God to give Israel laws regarding swine eaters. Clearly, it was considered food because God has to address it. So even in the Old Testament, Jews understood that pork was considered food by the surrounding nations. So they were definitely aware, and they were probably tempted and probably did eat it at times because Israel often disobeyed the Lord. But more importantly, in the New Testament, the audience was very much mixed of Jews and Gentiles. And in Rome, we know that pork was a part of a staple of their diet. So this audience absolutely would have understood the word food to include pork. Now, at this point, somebody will say, well, Deuteronomy 13, verse 5 tells us that if somebody changes the law, then that person is a false prophet and you ought to kill them. But again, we need to look at what the Torah actually says. Deuteronomy 18, we have not only Deuteronomy 13, but Moses writes here in Deuteronomy 18, and he says specifically verse 18, that God will raise up for them a prophet like them from among their brothers. And what God's going to do is he's not saying, I'm going to point them back to Moses, right? He says, I will put my words in his mouth. So this prophet that's going to come with further revelation from God. He shall speak to them all that I command him. This is Hebrews chapter 1, right? Long ago and many times, many places, God spoke to us by the prophets, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So what the law says is that another prophet is coming, and that prophet is going to speak further words, further revelation. It doesn't say he's going to go back to Sinai. He's going to keep teaching them what Moses taught. It says he's going to bring further revelation. Now, to be clear, Christians who object to this contemporary Torah observance don't reject our need to keep the law. For example, read the Lutheran Book of Concord, for example. We've always understood the need to keep the law. We just understand that that's fulfilled not in going back to Sinai, but in keeping what Jesus says, which leads us to our last point. Inevitably, somebody will bring up Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law, until it is all accomplished. So, Torah observants will point at this all day long, and they'll say, see, like you need to keep Sinai. You need to keep Sinai. Now, remember, Deuteronomy 18, the prophet's going to come, and he's going to speak new revelation. Now, here's why this is important. In the book of Matthew, Matthew structures his gospel like the Torah. It's filled with narrative and 5 discourses, like the 5 books of the Torah. Here, this dissertation, fairly sure, is part of the first book of Matthew. And what Jesus does is he uses 2 inclusios. An inclusio is a literary bracket where you say a phrase at the opening of your teaching and then you say it again at the end. The inclusio used here in verse 17 is law and prophets. For example, if we go to Matthew chapter 7, you'll see it again. Verse 12. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. When Jesus says that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, and then when he closes his Sermon on the Mount in this same way, what he's saying is everything that he's taught is the substance of the law and the prophets. In other words, the new revelation that Jesus brought does not contradict prior revelation, but in Jesus' case, not only does it fulfill the righteousness that Moses attested to, it actually heightens it, which is why Jesus often says, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. And so Matthew 5, verse 17, is not saying go back to Moses. Jesus is saying, what I'm about to teach you is the substance of Sinai and the prophets. In other words, Jesus is saying, keep my words. Keep my words as Moses said. That's what the Torah taught. Torah says that the prophet to come is going to teach the words that we need to keep. And Jesus is saying, by opening and closing his sermon this way with law and prophets, he's saying, that's what my teaching is. That's why in the Transfiguration, when Jesus has Moses and Elijah with him, God says, this is my beloved son. He doesn't say listen to Moses. He says listen to him. And so to keep Jesus' teaching, as contained in the Gospels and preserved by his apostles, is to keep the righteousness that the law has always attested to. But the ceremonial and the civil have passed away, as Galatians 3 says. But I want to draw your attention to one more thing. In Matthew 5, verse 18, Jesus actually says the Sinai covenant will pass away. Right, verse 18? I say unto you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So what Jesus is saying there is the Sinai covenant's going to pass away when heaven and earth do. Now, what is that referring to? Well, one, in Deuteronomy, I think it's 30 verse 19, heaven and earth function as judicial witnesses, right? That's what the Sinai covenant was saying. God says, I'm going to summon heaven and earth as witnesses against you. And Matthew picks up on that here. He's not using it here to speak of the new heavens and the new earth, which is true. That's going to happen. That's what John talks about. But the way Matthew's using heaven and earth passing away here is he's using it as a judicial witness to testify against Israel's unrighteousness. Because what you need to ask is, not only does Jesus say the law is going to pass away when heaven and earth do, when do heaven and earth pass away in Matthew's gospel? Because this is another inclusio. This is another literary bracket. Okay, heaven and earth passing away comes up again in Matthew 24. And Jesus tells us when heaven and earth are going to pass away. Listen to Matthew 24, verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation, the people listening to him, will not pass away until all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, if you notice what happens there, Jesus is saying heaven and earth passing away is going to happen in the lifetime of the generation of his present audience. Heaven and earth will pass away, and that's when Jesus said that's when the Sinai covenant will pass away, when heaven and earth pass away. But notice what's not going to pass away. His words will not pass away. Well, when does that happen? Well, sure enough, when Jesus is crucified, what happens? When Jesus is crucified, the sky goes dark, and the earth quakes. Sorry, trying to find it real quickly. Come on, somewhere around there. Okay, crucifixion, yeah. Verse 45. Now from the 6th hour, there was darkness all over the land. Darkness throughout the Old Testament is a sign of the judgment of God. When you think of the Exodus plague. So the heavens give witness, as Deuteronomy 30 says, they've passed away, passed judgment upon Jesus. So darkness over the land. And then when he dies, verse 54, when the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly this was the Son of God. So the heavens and the earth testify. We have cosmic judgment being witnessed to by the heavens and the earth. And as Jesus says, the law will pass away. Sinai will pass away when heaven and earth do. That's what he's saying in Matthew 5, verse 18. But the question is, how does Matthew conclude his gospel? Well, Jesus goes up on a mountain, just like Moses did to give the 10 Commandments. What does Jesus do? Well, he stands up on a mountain right here. He's being worshipped. And instead of coming down with tablets of stone, what does he say? All authority is mine. Verse 19, go therefore make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And what are you to do? Verse 20, teach them to observe my commandments. Jesus' commandments are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. If you are keeping Jesus' commandments, you are keeping the law in a way everyone under the Sinai covenant could not do. That's what Paul's getting at in 2 Corinthians 3. You want evidence of the Spirit's power in my ministry? Look at you, Corinth. You bunch of Gentiles, and suddenly you love righteousness. Suddenly holiness matters to you. Why? Because the law of God was written on their hearts. Well, what commands were that? Well, these commands that Jesus is talking about here. So again, I think we keep Torah by obeying Jesus. But Jesus isn't teaching us to go back under the Sinai covenant. He's teaching us as the fulfillment of all of Torah. And so we can't be selective in our observance of Torah. We need to interpret Torah the way the New Testament does.